Thank you all for being here. Professor Freeman, you can get us started.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kate. Thanks everyone for joining us for this presentation, this panel discussion of is the Peace Corps still relevant? My name is Scott Freeman. I'm faculty at the School of International Service here at American University. And I'm really excited to have what I hope is a really nice conversation and reflection among some folks with deep knowledge of the Peace Corps and reflections on it. Yeah. So I'll give a kind of a sense of what we'll do today, and then introduce the panelists. The discussion is going to last for about an hour, and we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes of questions toward the end for the Q&A. So if you'd like to ask a question, go ahead and submit it through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. And then for those of you who need closed captioning, that is available, and please just click on the option at the bottom of your screen for closed captioning.
And Scott, right before we get started, Kate, would you please enable the video of the other interpreter? There's two of us and we're going to be switching. She can't get her video on.
Yes, I can do that. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, excellent. And then additionally, we ask that no one record this session. We'll be recording the webinar and it'll be available on the SIS YouTube channel, so no need for any other recording. So I'd like to introduce briefly our panelists, and then the panelists are going to give us a bit more of an explanation about their relationship to Peace Corps and how that perspective shapes their reflections for today. We're joined by Susan Shepler, who's also faculty at SIS and served in Peace Corps in Sierra Leone. We're also joined by Gwendolyn Schaefer, who's a senior program manager of USAID programs for the Institute of International Education, and is herself a returned Peace Corps volunteer from Ukraine and Macedonia. We're also joined by Anita Quintero, the training manager for Peace Corps in Colombia, and Chimeka Njoku, Peace Corps community health educator and returned Peace Corps volunteer from Cameroon, serving from 2018 to 2020. So I'm going to start with some framing comments to sort of get us thinking about the types of critiques and reflections that we want to have today. And so what I want to start out by doing is kind of paint these two visions of what the Peace Corps is or is supposed to be. And then we'll sort of wrestle it out and talk it out in the discussion. The Peace Corps began with this founding idea in 1961, as many of us know, with John F. Kennedy pitching the idea to college students. The idea that their skills and knowledges could be spread across the world to help those in need. And since then, over 200,000 volunteers have gone across the world, dedicating their service to partnerships in education, agriculture, water and sanitation, youth, health, business, and many more programs. And volunteers spend at least 2 years living in a community, learning the language, the practices, and the perspectives of their host counterparts. Now, all of these efforts go along, I think, with a narrative of the Peace Corps about spreading peace and fighting inequality and injustice. Years after its founding, Sergeant Shriver, the architect and implementer of the Peace Corps, spoke at the 40th anniversary of the Peace Corps. And he said, quote, "Be servants of peace, work humbly, persistently, and intelligently. Weep with those who are sorrowful, care for those who are sick, serve your neighbors, serve your towns, serve the poor. That is your challenge." And so this idea of peace spreading and justice-minded individuals is a powerful organizing principle and one that brought many volunteers to the field, including myself. But the narrative and message of Peace Corps has also been challenged, or this narrative and message of Peace Corps has also been challenged. During the Cold War, the Peace Corps was in many ways a non-military diplomatic strategy to spread American ideals and the idea that America is here to spread goodwill and to help. Right? As such, it forms part of a larger apparatus of the US state. Is it then also a neo-colonial project by which young American youth are sent across the world to reinforce the idea or an idea of what the United States is? Do Peace Corps programs and partnerships always help the recipient countries and communities? Or is it primarily a training program for young Americans that perhaps, though not necessarily, provides a small benefit to recipient countries? So this tension between the ideals of the Peace Corps and its role in the larger US imperial projects, I think is a large part of our subject, or the subject of our conversation today. But rather than theorize in broad strokes, sort of looking from top down, in sometimes many of the ways that we do in academia, theorizing the nation state and its role in the world, this panel is really important in giving sort of a nuanced perspective on the tensions between those two narratives, right? How does the experience of Peace Corps volunteers and those close to the Peace Corps help us to understand these sort of combating narratives? Can they exist at the same time? What are the experiences of Peace Corps in the field, or Peace Corps volunteers in the field, who have wrestled deeply with these thoughts? And I know that among our panelists, I think Susan and I see this panel as a long time coming in Peace Corps, or in SIS, as we talk to a lot of students who have interest in Peace Corps and really want to wrestle with these questions from the start. So I thought I'd start by asking the panelists to give a brief description of their relationship to the Peace Corps, and then reflect on these broader critiques of the Peace Corps, foreign policy, colonial structures. How have you seen those critiques play out in your individual experiences? So why don't we start with our own faculty member here, Susan Shepler, who can get the conversation started.
Thanks, Scott. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. I just want to say that, I was in the Peace Corps in the 80s, unlike many of the others here. I'm the old woman on the panel. And I want to say that we were thinking about these questions in the 80s too. Definitely when I was thinking of joining the Peace Corps in the 80s, I went to UC Santa Cruz, which is a pretty liberal place. Lots of people asked me, why are you a tool? Why do you want to be a tool of the US government? Have you thought about neocolonialism? And in particular, the US was very active in Central America at the time. So people were organizing around US out of El Salvador. And to be honest, I was a math major and I really loved math and I wanted to spread the good news about math around the world. So I joined the Peace Corps to teach math. And I have to say, I got so much from the Peace Corps. It really changed the whole direction of my life. I now study Sierra Leone, the country where I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I married a Sierra Leonean for some time. I go back to Sierra Leone pretty much every year now and continue to work in education there at higher education levels now, but now teaching kind of critical theory and critical development theory to Sierra Leoneans who are trying to address the issues of, decolonizing development in their country. And so I will also reflect on my experience as a Peace Corps volunteer, that while I was in my village teaching math, I felt really far from the US government. Nobody from Peace Corps ever came and visited me in my village. And I could basically do what I wanted. So the idea that the Peace Corps was somehow controlling me, as some kind of US puppet is not clear, not true. But then the question becomes, was my very Americanness that was in my bones, was my American habitus, used somehow to infiltrate the Sierra Leonean village? And I do know that some people there assumed that I worked for the CIA. And I had to keep telling them, no, why would the CIA send a silly little math teacher to spy on you people? And what I tell students all the time is Peace Corps had so much more impact on me than I think it did on the people that I was working with. And I think I was lucky that as a high school teacher, basically, I could be like one of the other high school teachers and do my job the way that my Sierra Leonean colleagues did. And I didn't stand out as, you know, a tool of development or a tool of imperialism. I just felt like another math teacher in the teachers' lounge. But then I'll just end by saying that I often think that I didn't have that much impact, the work that I did. And I tell people like Sierra Leone's much more about what I got out of it than what I feel like I did for others. But I did, you know, a couple of years ago, I was drinking palm wine near the village where I taught many years ago. And somebody said, Miss Susan, you probably don't remember me. You were my math teacher all those years ago. And I was like, oh, that's great. I don't remember, you know, that was 30 years ago. And he's like, and I'm now a math teacher at that same school where you taught. And I think about you all the time and the impact that you had on me. And so I think there's an individual level impact that's much more about friendships and yeah, that's where I'll end. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks for getting us started, Susan. Chimeka, would you like to step up and follow up with your thoughts?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks so much, Scott, and thanks again to the SIS for inviting me to this. So I was a Peace Corps volunteer from 2018 until the COVID pandemic in 2020. So I was there for about 1.5 years and had about a half year of my service left. And when I came back, I joined this group called Decolonizing Peace Corps, which started around the summer of 2020, and we've been running ever since then. And essentially what we do and what we believe is that the Peace Corps needs to end and it needs to be abolished sometime in the near future. And what we do is just educate people on social media, predominantly on Instagram, on the various ways in which Peace Corps is a tool of neocolonialism, is a tool of imperialism, is a tool of white supremacy, and reflect upon the ways that we, as a group, most of us, all of us being Black and Brown people, have contributed to that. But yeah, I think I would say that I certainly agree with the criticisms. As Susan mentioned, these criticisms have existed ever since Peace Corps itself has existed. Peace Corps, starting in 1961, did start in a lot of countries, especially African countries, essentially right after their independence. So I served in Cameroon, and Peace Corps has essentially been there ever since Cameroon's independence up until the evacuation, through all sorts of civil crises, all sorts of humanitarian crises. And it's usually something that Peace Corps as an organization is very proud of, but it's something that I think is very sad and very telling of what Peace Corps actually is and represents. So yeah, I think that there are a lot of questions that need to be asked about who is really asking for Peace Corps in these countries and in these communities. Peace Corps claims that they are invited, which I'm sure they are in some sort of bureaucratic governmental way, but whoever's making that decision isn't necessarily the people that we as volunteers are working with. So I think that's a very big question to be asking. And an even bigger question is that all of the resources that we funnel into Peace Corps as an organization, why can't we just funnel into these countries and into these communities directly, into organizations that already exist? It costs about, I believe the last number was about $55,000. I'm sure it's gone up, almost $60,000 to sustain a volunteer abroad. Not that any of us volunteers are paid that or anything close to that, but just all of the resources that's taken to sustain one volunteer. And then imagine if all of that was just given directly to my village and to the organizations that I worked with, and all the projects they could finish that they actually want to finish versus what the Peace Corps sets as what volunteers should be working on. And then also the fact that many of the volunteers that are sent over, most of them are not only inexperienced, right out of college, like me, I was right out of college, had essentially no experience, and also most of them being white. So what does that mean? And how are we like framing development, in that we are setting the metrics of what is development, and then also we are sending underqualified people to the field when many of these communities have people there that are already doing community health work and teachers and all of those things, why can't we just pay them, give them a proper salary and support the efforts that they're already leading themselves? They're the ones that need to be leading their development, because otherwise it is neocolonialist, because we're the ones that are imposing, we're the ones that are not just imposing, but physically there. That I don't understand why that's necessary. But there's much more I can say about that, but I'll stop there for now.
Great, thanks, Jamaica, for also reframing it, not just is the Peace Corps relevant, but should the Peace Corps exist, right? Really nice, thank you. Gwendolyn, would you like to follow up?
Absolutely, and I'm going to thank SIS as well as all other panelists for having me on what was a really interesting and very timely, an overdue conversation, I would say. So my relationship with Peace Corps is that I first served in Ukraine in 2013 to 2014, where I was evacuated 8 years ago to the day that Russia invaded again on February 24th, 2022. So I did my service there, and then I was able to serve again in North Macedonia from 2014 to 2016. In both of those instances, I was a secondary education volunteer. So I was also in a high school setting, which I think is one of the easier transitions to embed yourself as a Peace Corps volunteer in a community. Overall, I want to say and emphasize throughout this conversation that I recognize that I served in 2 European countries, which particularly as a white woman does color my experience and relationship with the Peace Corps. I understand that volunteer experiences vary greatly from country to country, and even the generation of when you served and who was leading Peace Corps operations in the country at that time. So, I would say take my context and understanding, or my comments, my context of Peace Corps with the understanding that while I did have a very positive overall experience as a PCV, I recognize and I really share many of the critiques of the organization, which my fellow panelists have already mentioned, and the legacy of neocolonialism here. I think that one of the greatest challenges of the organization is the framing of its purpose, its history, and its current identity. It's branded and sees itself as this development tool, this development instrument, which honestly runs counter to the experience of myself and many other PCVs, and it really sets, I think, false expectations for both the host country nationals of where you're serving, as well as the PCVs. Another panelist mentioned that by and large, you have young individuals in their 20s, especially out of college. I was one of those as well. I had some teaching experience, like not much. And while I did certainly learn, I was not going there to impart all the wisdom of my years, right? It is very much more I'm learning. And so I think whenever we brand it as a development and treat it as a development instrument, that's really where we run into a lot of these core issues, both by the work itself and the failures and the impacts on the community, but also how the volunteers in the community see and experience their service. I can't tell you how many times myself and other colleagues are in situations where it's like, well, why is my project coming up? Am I wanted here? Do I want this? And it was all framed about the work piece of it. And then when that was taken away and it was focused on the relationship building piece and that reciprocal relationship, that was very different. So I think that though, with the framing of this, soft diplomacy piece of Peace Corps, it's really key. I think it can have great potential, but it's dependent upon how that's framed. So if it's framed and promoted as understood as promoting American exceptionalism, America knows best, this is a failure of the organization, I think, and often is very much tied to these neocolonial themes and white saviorism, particularly in places unlike where I serve, right? Where you have a bunch of white young volunteers going in and saying, hey, we know best, learn from us, even though we have no experience. But I think if it's promoted and understood as more of a reciprocal understanding and dialogue, it can be a great tool. And so in my own personal experience, Peace Corps only really works when it's framed in the latter. It's a reciprocal dialogue and cross-cultural exchange. And I've seen this, I've thought that for some time, but I've really seen this on display with the tragedy that is Ukraine right now. I can't begin to tell you the outreach and support from the RPCV community of Ukraine volunteers being very involved and in the weeds and trying to get people out of the country, sending aid to those who are fighting, crowdsourcing some funds, you name it, it's being done. And I think that it's times like this, unfortunately, that show us that that linkage can have a really big impact years. I mean, it's people who left 20, 30 years ago from Peace Corps Ukraine, and it's still very involved and in touch with people, and that relationship is strong. So I think there is power around it, but it really depends on how it's framed. And then really on the last note, I think that for this to take place and to be successful in the future, Peace Corps first has to embrace that identity and look critically at who and how it recruits and supports Peace Corps volunteers in service. So there must be more power placed in the hands of the local staff and organizations, and not just from DC. Cannot focus on quantity over quality, nor overemphasize many oftentimes arbitrary key indicators and all of that. So it kind of goes back to, what are we trying to do here? And depending on how that's framed, it can be a success or a failure.
Thanks, Gwendolyn. That's a really useful framing of, or setting up the possibility of like, well, wait a second, maybe this development framing is really problematic, and it's actually much more of a sort of educational intercultural type of exchange, right? That goes on here, and I think that's notable. I think that Peace Corps has really focused on metrics and sort of selling itself as a development organization, which sort of solidifies that framing, right? Solidifies and is trying to sort of prove its worth as a development organization, and that, right, is very clearly sort of the way that narrative is being spun. Thank you, Nita. We'd love to hear from you next.
Hi, everyone, and thank you again for having me in this conversation, very relevant and timely. So this is Nita Quintero. I'm here as a Colombian first, as local staff as well of Peace Corps. I've been in the agency since 2010. In Colombia, Peace Corps was one of the first countries of the groups arriving in the 60s. But then due to the violence, volunteers have to be evacuated, and then we return, or Peace Corps return to Colombia in 2010. So I've been with the agency ever since, in different roles, and I have interacted, of course, and have different experience from a personal and professional level, not only with agency, but interacting with volunteers and staff, local and Americans, and to me has been really enriching. And first of all, I definitely have to acknowledge that I think all concerns are valid, and I think this is an important conversation to have. And even though I'm not talking about, I'm talking on, from my own perspective, not agency, the agency perspective, as a Colombian and in my personal experience. I think we as a team here in Colombia, and as Colombia, we have seen a transformation since we, like in the last 5 years of our work and the conversations that the agency has promoted, like us as local staff and the support and that we have received in terms of how to continue like working in a way that it's more pushed by the community. So first, I have the other thing I wanted to share is that from my view, and I mean, like as a Colombian, I think that is culturally as well that I just feel like I haven't seen anyone achieving something alone. There is always a support system, whatever that be, you know, person, community, organization, you know, like, and definitely I believe in as a Colombian, and again in from my background in the power of community and at a common vision, and that we really need to connect personally, and that's one of the big pieces, and that I relate to greatly with the agency, that it's about and I think Susan and Gwendolyn, like I relate to your comments that it's a transformational exchange, but it's mutual, and that's what I've seen. I've changed myself as Colombian, as the staff of the Peace Corps, and I've seen volunteers change a lot, because it's definitely a professional, but more that it's a personal experience, a transformation. So definitely I would love to share a lot of what we had worked, and in terms of communities like that I work with as well, and what I've seen with my eyes out in you know, with my own local communities. But I also have seen definitely again a change in the language, also acceptance in that we really need to start as Peace Corps involved in this. I mean, including and start having these conversations and kind of doing something. So that's from that side, but yeah, definitely that's part of my personal journey, and also the transformation. I'm the current training manager, so I am also part of that role, like, you know, what is needed now for a future volunteer to know, understand if you want to come in and you know, and serve, not save, if I may. So that's part of our challenge as well, because definitely me as a Colombian, we have this culture that is better giving than receiving. So that's not something that it's, you know, like particularly bad for us, like, you know, like that, you know, that we are gonna. I think the culture to share and welcome and meet everyone is intrinsic, and is absolutely natural to Colombians, and that's something that definitely in my feel for I would say I don't know if the right word is outsiders, but from foreign cultures, being like that it's been a violation of our like I don't know, local rights, or we have been robbed or something like that. So I believe it's more culturally than you know, like that an actual put it in the words of neocolonialism or this all critiques. So that's for now what I have to share. Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks, Nita. And it's really interesting to think about sort of the framing that's being given to training. I think I also had a really critical training perspective, where we were asked to consider this from the get-go. Which is so I'm interested to also hear, as we go forward, like the types of things that you're seeing that not just the framing, but is there any sort of change in the way that Peace Corps in Colombia is any specific changes that have been made, or is it sort of like the way that we talk about Peace Corps service? I'd be fascinated to hear a little bit more about that, and maybe what I'll do is I'll throw out this next question, and then as you're inspired, we can just sort of pop around to those who'd like to address it. But I think that the other side then, and we've got this nice set up for our discussion, right? On the one hand, we've got the idea of like, should Peace Corps even exist? And right, is decolonization require Peace Corps to sort of absolve itself, right? And on the other hand, well, are there ways that the relationships that we form in Peace Corps allow for a type of deep solidarity that otherwise might not be there? Or right, or are those types of solidarity sort of still premised on this type of neocolonial act? And so it'd be great to hear also, I think Gwendolyn started us off nicely of thinking about the ways that the current sort of crisis has allowed for that type of solidarity. So those sort of examples are really helpful. Susan, you want to start us off?
No, I wanted to ask you to share your experience because you're also an RPCV and we can hear your story.
Oh, I like that. Thanks, Susan. Yeah, so I was an RPCV in the Dominican Republic from 2005 to 2007, and I feel like each of the speakers, I feel like your statements resonated with me. The deep critiques of how much privilege I had as a white male walking through the Dominican Republic, how I could sort of walk into the mayor's office, right? That wasn't right. I didn't know what I was doing at all, right? Why should I have the door opened for me when my counterparts working in NGOs had struggled so much, right? And so there was a very quick realization that that's problematic. I think, like Susan, my experience in Peace Corps actually, well, and perhaps like many of us, right? My experience in Peace Corps led me with so many questions that I went to graduate school and became an anthropologist and continue to work in the Dominican Republic and Haiti to wrestle with those and to try and continue the types of relationships that I sort of established, right? And so I think in many ways, the debates that we're having right now are still debates that are very much alive and that I still have with myself and with my students as I think about this. One of the things that I think about in terms, right? So I've outlined some of the ways that I think that there's sort of a reinforcement of a type of, in my case, white male privilege. There's this interesting way that it's a similar sort of a moment to Gwendolyn's, where former Peace Corps volunteers in the Dominican Republic came together for political change in the Dominican Republic against citizenship acts against Haitian descendants in the Dominican Republic. So without going into too much detail, there were a series of really repressive measures by the Dominican government in 2015 to make citizenship extremely difficult, if not impossible, for descendants of Haitians and Haitians living in the Dominican Republic. And something really impressive occurred, which was a group of Peace Corps volunteers got together and collected, oh gosh, I've forgotten how many hundred signatures, but sent it to Chris Dodd, who was a senator from Connecticut, who was himself a returned Peace Corps volunteer from the Dominican Republic, and sent it to John Kerry, essentially saying that they wanted to take the Leahy Amendment, which was that the US would not give aid to countries that were committing human rights violations, and sort of use that as muscle to sort of pressure for these changes. I think it was a really remarkable moment for a number of reasons. One is it demonstrates the types of solidarity that can be formed and what can be sort of leveraged by returned Peace Corps volunteers. But it was also a very sort of political act in a context of, right, Peace Corps is supposed to be very apolitical, right? We don't make comments about citizenship and human rights and whatnot. And yet the relationships had been formed to essentially push back against human rights violations. I think, sort of one of the reasons I wanted to share that is thinking about solidarities that are formed, but also in the context of like, and yet, does this break out of a type of colonial relationship, or does this reinforce one, right? In what ways is this an example of a pushback against that and development of a deep solidarity that breaks out of it, or does it simply reinforce the types of privilege and power that volunteers have? So with that, maybe throwing that question out to you all, moments of potential challenge to that critique and whether they reinforce or break out of a colonial dynamic. Go ahead, Susan.
So a couple of thoughts from what we've been talking about so far. I agree with this, that it's better to reframe it, not as a development organization. It's not a development organization. And we who've served in it know it. I really like Scott's use of the term solidarity, because I think that what Peace Corps can do is forge these person-to-person connections that are outside of nation state frameworks or outside of the massive power differentials in the world. And it does that by this individual solidarity, right? That it gives you the perspective of living in that kind of poverty, in my case, that has then served for the rest of my life as that solidarity is something I draw on in my work as an anthropologist, in my living as an American. And I want to respond really quickly to Chimeka's point. Basically, that thing of, volunteers it costs the US government $50,000 a year to sustain a volunteer. I mean, that's a powerful number. But I just want to counter with, I don't know that it would make any difference to take that money and put it into a traditional development project anyway. I mean, I feel like part of the solidarity that I got as a volunteer, or part of the perspective I got as a volunteer, is sitting with my fellow villagers and watching stupid development projects happen, or watching people drive by in air-conditioned SUVs and thinking like, what's that money for? And so throwing money at, my critique of development comes from my experience of sitting by the side of the road with other poor teachers and being like, well, that's stupid. Finally, I want to respond to something that was in the chat, which is, if this is an exchange program, why is it so one way? How come it's sending Americans there, but never bringing people from around the world here? I totally agree with that. But I think that my experience of the power of this kind of cultural exchange has made me now, in my role as a professor, very much about trying to get people to move back and forth, right? Trying to get my African students opportunities to study elsewhere, trying to ensure that our incoming class of PhD students is as international as possible. Yeah, I'll stop there.
I would just kind of echo the sentiment of the exchange piece, because I completely agree with the comment about we're talking about reciprocal nature. Well, we can't just be sending Americans abroad. And I professionally work in the international exchange and partnership space. And so I think there is so much great potential if we're looking at funds and resources along that front for that to happen. And I think too, Peace Corps got its three goals, and that third goal being about the American volunteers coming back and spreading the word about their country. And I think most RPCVs are really good about doing that. I gave the example of Ukraine. Also with Macedonia, most people don't know that North Macedonia is a country. And so it's been a really great experience, sharing a lot about our experience and then people there and advocating for things. But one of the things with Peace Corps is, in terms of resources, it stops as soon as you end your service. And so for, again, serious about this idea of exchange and going back, we got to look beyond this period of 27 months. So yes, if you're keeping the 27-month period for Peace Corps volunteers, look at how we use our resources in that space, but also what kind of resources can we provide, financially or otherwise, to support the third goal and related aspects of the Peace Corps. And again, back to that exchange piece and bringing people to the U.S., I think is an excellent point and something that should be explored.
I don't think we told people what the third goal means. Can you explain that?
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to mess this up for sure. But basically, in sum, it's about whenever you're a Peace Corps volunteer, you're coming back to the U.S. and you're essentially spreading the word and sharing information and making connections with Americans about the place of your service.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on a few points that have been made. The first one being Peace Corps not being an international development agency, which I agree it isn't at all. I think we all agree with that. But however, its budget does come primarily from the foreign aid sector, and organizations such as USAID and PEPFAR and various other things are what make up most of its budget. So for Peace Corps to not be an international development agency would mean that it cannot tap into those resources, and therefore it wouldn't be the same organization, and it probably wouldn't have the same amount of funding, it wouldn't have the same amount of reach. This is why I believe mostly goal one is in place in the first place, to train locals and all of that, and to be a development agency. And that's why we also have to meet all those certain indicators, a lot of which don't necessarily apply to the various places we work at, but we're required to meet them because that's how we continue to get our funding. So I'd like to address that first. Secondly, in terms of international development, if we instead gave the money directly to the organizations, that's what I'm proposing. We directly give the money to the local organizations, to the local communities that are there, many of whom we worked with as Peace Corps volunteers. I'm not asking that we throw the money at these at development organizations, at US-based development organizations, because I believe that international development as a whole, as a field currently, should be abolished currently as it stands. And that's what Decolonizing Peace Corps believes generally as well. So I think that all of that needs to completely be reframed for it to be ethical and sustainable. And then in terms of like standing in solidarity with others that are there, certainly like there are emotional connections that form amongst volunteers in their communities. I had a lot of those. I had a positive experience as well in Peace Corps, which I think sometimes people confuse because of my stance. I actually had a very good experience. I'm Nigerian born, I'm African. My village ethnically correlates a lot with my actual ethnic identity. And so I can say that I felt a lot of solidarity with the people I served with, but that's because they literally looked like my parents and my aunts and my siblings and like looked like me. And I don't think that it's impossible to form solidarity or try to be sympathetic and empathetic to others that we don't relate to. I think that's important, and that's something we should try to do. However, I don't think that Peace Corps volunteers are capable of doing so, because in my experience, I didn't witness that happening. In fact, I did see people and volunteers actively causing harm to their communities, whether intentionally or unintentionally, whether we want to talk about sexual assault, the current scandal going on right now with the murder in Tanzania. For those of you who aren't aware, a Peace Corps employee happened to kill someone in Tanzania, and then Peace Corps allowed this person to flee the country and hide out in the US and continue to get paid. And only now did it come out 2 years later due to investigative journalism. So I think that's a big example of that, and various other examples with microaggressions and other things. So volunteers are causing harm. Volunteers are appropriating instead of appreciating culture. I think there's a specific nuance there, and that speaks to the lack of training that volunteers don't get as Peace Corps volunteers in these countries. There is no training on colonialism or on history, many of these places, and many of the volunteers don't take it upon themselves to do that research. And therefore they're harmless, whether or not they're intending to. They're they're being careless and appropriating culture. And then lastly, I can say that Peace Corps volunteers and organizations can't stand in solidarity with a lot of these communities because they don't stand in solidarity with people of color within the Peace Corps themselves. So I have a lot of examples I can draw on for myself and other Black and brown volunteers that I served with, where our colleagues were disrespectful, using racial slurs and various things, where when you're sending white people that have essentially no experience with Black or brown people in the States and cannot even stand in solidarity with Black and brown people in the States and their struggles here, how do you expect them to do the same thing abroad? It's not possible. Instead, they're going to be even more reckless due to the lack of oversight that Susan had mentioned, because there is very little oversight, in fact. And there's a huge power dynamic that happens, especially when your skin is white in an environment where other people are not. And there's no training and education for the volunteers on that. And so they're actively reckless, and then the education falls on people like me and other colleagues to teach and educate these people, because we don't want to watch and witness them cause harm, not necessarily to us, but to the other people that we feel very much in solidarity with, that we relate to. And so if perhaps that were to change, but that didn't happen in Cameroon. I know I've spoken to a lot of people that served elsewhere. Didn't seem like that was the case in terms of training and education. And so that would definitely be a big, if we want to talk about reform, that would be a big avenue there. But I don't think that you can reform an organization that is intrinsically imperialistic and connected to the US government, which is an imperialistic agency. And so therefore, to decolonize it needs to simply end. Decolonization means the removal of a colonial power. And so it needs to be literally removed. And those resources need to be directly channeled to the organizations and the communities that we are supposed to serve.
So I think this brings up a point that I'd love to hear from Nira on, is the way, right, that if Peace Corps training itself does not include the possibility of critical introspection and reflection, then is it just allowing or Jamaica, as you're saying, sort of facilitating the potential for the continuity of a sort of white supremacist attitude towards the world, in my training, we actually read Paulo Freire and talked about all these sorts of really critical perspectives. But it occurs to me that that's not a like an institution-wide requirement. And so Chimeka's point of how do you sort of institutionally think about these things, Nira, I'd love to hear your perspective on how training in Colombia is thinking about and wrestling with those questions.
Yeah, thank you. And first, allow me to say that just to the point that Susan and Gwendolyn, and I think a little bit of Shimea did, I mean, in terms of like the agency, or like it goes free and the one and the first and second goal, which I feel as a local staff and as a Colombian that the goal one, which is the exchange of technical assistance between Americans and locals, kind of the technical training or capacity building, which is more capacity bridging instead, because we're both learning. For me, that goal is excuse to actually build a bridge between the cultures, be local and US. So that's what I've seen. That's the way that they hope to go and kind of build that relationship and be able to be an ambassador in locally, but also be an ambassador of the country where you serve, which is so I felt strongly. I mean, I've seen a lot about it. In my experience, what I've seen more, like, you know, like the development side of it, that more than that, like the exchange side. So, but to your question, I I've been in my role for about 4 years now. Like, you know, so since 2018, I was a training manager. I was in a different capacity in the administrative unit. But in the transition I've seen now about, I mean, especially about language and the big pieces, if you allow me to share a little bit about how our training is formed, it has a big component of course, a local language and culture if it's applicable. And I'll have another side of the side of the medical and safety kind of precautions that needs to be in place. And also kind of the core values of the agency that, you know, like that we definitely, that the agency wanna instill in a volunteer or wanna see in a volunteer, kind of reflect as an ambassador of the US. So with that in mind, particularly in Colombia, we have been working a lot on a mind shift. And my belief in my experience, I've seen a lot of conversations on power dynamics. We have kind of tried. We have like our minds on an appreciative approach in everything that we educate volunteers on, in terms of the humility and in terms of humility, you know, toward the culture that needs to be in place. Creating more space for change, and be careful about language, as I said. So in those parts, like a more that appreciating what the community brings, and the community is the one that actually like have actual agency, and that we need to trust what the community is able to do. We are just there to facilitate that and to show like that, just to like let them see what they have, and they be able to come up with their own ways to kind of do their like, you know, carry out their plans. So that's pretty much what like there. Like I have a few notes about the center message that at least in our post we have tried to instill in terms of the restore the dignity of individuals, like, because that's something that it has been very present in our culture, especially like, you know, when you have been told that you are a third world country, like, you know, worldwide, or as a global part of the global south or developing countries. So what does that mean, that you are? So for us, like emphasizing that language of that, you know, that everyone has a contribution and a role in society has been highly central to the work that, and also personal accountability of local. So that's part as well of what we believe in, and like in terms of building community, like or being there to like make them see that. So I will stop that if you have any, or anyone have another.
Yeah, thanks, Nita. And I think there's an amazing set of questions in the chat about, you know, are there arguments here for a turn towards Fulbright, right? The Peace Corps Foreign Affairs comes from the Foreign Affairs budget. That clarification that is also where Fulbright comes from, right? Is that a sort of an argument there? And also this provocative idea of like, well, is the pause in Peace Corps because of COVID an opening opportunity for sort of slowing down Peace Corps, if that's the argument there? Gwendolyn, I don't know if you wanted to follow up on some of those questions or any of the other points that have been raised.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to the point about, you know, folding it into something similar to Fulbright and other existing programs. You know, I've seen both from when I was a Peace Corps volunteer and living in other countries overseas outside of Peace Corps, as well as here, my perspective here in the US, working on exchange programming. I feel like they're very different very different tools. So there's something like, Fulbright and others, it's a much more of an academic lens. There is cross-cultural learning and things that happen, but it's a different thing. One of the things that one of the critiques and the things I appreciate about a Peace Corps is that training component. Because unfortunately, in talking to PCVs around the world, as sort of in a variety of contexts, the training you get in Peace Corps varies wildly in terms of messaging and all these dynamics we're talking about. I was lucky to serve in 2 countries that had excellent training programs that looked at all of these things that we're talking about, both in terms of the history and the relationships and the cultural exchange for the country of service, but also internally among volunteers. Doesn't mean it couldn't have gone further, but all I'm saying is that I received a very robust training in both instances. I know that's not volunteers' experience in others. What I witnessed by seeing individuals that did other programs like Fulbright, Erasmus Plus volunteers, you name it, they did not have the same level of training, both linguistically, but also for this kind of wraparound support services that Peace Corps can provide when done well. And so quite honestly, they weren't nearly as effective. They kind of stayed within their little bubbles, and they certainly weren't out with a variety of people in local communities, and we're usually in more capital areas and stuff like that. So while I'm not saying, oh, let's abolish those programs or anything like that, I think they are different, and so that's just kind of some food for thought whenever you're thinking about how do these different types of exchange programs. I think there's aspects that Peace Corps can do really well. It's a matter of, is that institutionalized? Are we doing the right types of reforms? And that's again taken with the understanding that yes, this has an institution that has some really deeply embedded things that it's a big if, can and will it change. But if the conversation is about what things could we do, that is a piece of it to look at.
Yeah, great thoughts there. And I think that sort of those perspectives on the types of exchange that occur through an academic lens versus a sort of a different framing of Peace Corps is something to really consider along with that training, right? The love and hate relationship with the types of training that we can or maybe have touched on in some countries, and the lack of it across the board. I would love to keep us all later for basically another hour to extend this conversation, because it's been such a good one. And I feel like any good conversation has left us with more questions, but perhaps better questions and more refined questions than we started out with. And so I hope that we've integrated a number of the chat questions into our conversations here, and gave a little bit of a perspective on how each of us are thinking about our past histories of Peace Corps, our current involvement with Peace Corps, and the ways that Peace Corps might change in the future. So I want to thank all of our participants for coming in: Gwendolyn, Nita, Susan, and Jamaica, for giving us really thoughtful and reflective comments on your Peace Corps service and the idea of Peace Corps in the future. I think it's a conversation that we at AU, at SIS in particular, really need to continue to have in the future. So hopefully we can all stay connected and keep the conversation going. Yeah.